All right, everyone, kick back and get ready. Our first story tonight takes us to a place you'd never expect to have a brush with pure, unadulterated evil. A thrift shop in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. This isn't a story about a haunted object or a ghostly whisper. This is about a face-to-face encounter with something ancient and terrifying. Our narrator was having a pretty normal day. She was just killing some time before dinner, browsing the racks of a local thrift store. She tried on a few outfits, eavesdropped on some drama between other shoppers. You know, the usual stuff. But as she was finishing up, a strange and powerful feeling washed over her. It started with a physical sensation. Chills erupted all over her body, followed by a wave of nausea. But it was more than that. Her mind started spinning. She felt confused, disoriented, and for a few terrifying moments, she couldn't even remember where she was or why she was there. Shaken and feeling unwell, she decided to ditch her shopping and just head home. She walked out of the store and into the parking lot. She was about halfway to her car when a pickup truck pulled up alongside her and stopped. It was a little odd, but she didn't think much of it, and that's when the world changed. She describes the sky suddenly growing dark, as if a storm had rolled in an instant. Her vision became blurry, and everything felt slightly unreal. The truck's engine cut off, and a man, who she guessed was in his late 40s, climbed out and walked toward the back of his truck. A powerful sense of unease settled over her, a deep, primal feeling that something was terribly wrong. She kept walking, her pace quickening. Just then, she heard a voice in her head. It wasn't a human voice, and it didn't use actual words. She describes it as more of a feeling, a powerful, undeniable command that had only one message: run. She risked one last look back at the man, and this time they made eye contact. In that single, heart-stopping moment, she says she had never feared for her life more. The man's eyes were not human. They were black. As she put it, blackest night without a moon. Out. And then he grinned. It was the most evil, malevolent grin she had ever seen, a horrifying display of yellow, rotten teeth. He began to walk towards her, and she saw he was holding something in his hands. She couldn't see what it was, and she didn't want to find out. The moment felt like a nightmare, a surreal and traumatizing scene she desperately wanted to wake up from. Ow. But this was real. Breaking the terrifying eye contact, she did the only thing she could. She ran. Fumbling with her keys, she jumped into her car, slammed and locked the door, and peeled out of that parking lot without looking back. Once she was a safe distance away, she had to pull over. She was shaking uncontrollably, dizzy and gasping for breath. The fear was so overwhelming it was a physical force. As she sat there, trying to calm her racing heart, she noticed the sky was starting to become light again. The world, which had been black and fuzzy, slowly came back into focus. And then the horrifying realization hit her. The feeling of dread in the store, the darkness, the black eyes. The evil grin. She believed she had been shown a glimpse of the devil himself. He hadn't spoken a word, hadn't made a sound, but the aura of pure malice that came off of him was something she would never forget. She had made it home physically safe. But the memory of what she saw in that parking lot on October 15th, 2015, was a scar that would never fade. All right, for our second story, we're heading out to the desolate back roads of Central California. This one is a chilling tale of a late-night journey gone wrong. It's a story that blurs the line between a bizarre prank and something far more sinister. It's about what happens when you're stranded alone, and the only car that stops for you isn't what it seems. The year was 1999. Our narrator had been at a party in the small town of San Joaquin. After getting into a drunken fight and discovering his ride had bailed on him, he made the ill-advised decision to start walking the 8 miles home to the neighboring town of Tranquility. It was a cold, stormy night. He was walking along the main highway that connected the two towns, a lonely stretch of road surrounded by vast, dark fields. He was about a third of the way home, freezing and regretting his decision, when he saw headlights approaching. He stuck out his thumb, hoping for a ride, but the car just blew past him, and another one did the same. Just as he was about to give up and turn back, he saw a third set of headlights. He stuck out his thumb one last time. This car also drove past him, but then, to his immense relief, the brake lights flashed. The car pulled over onto the shoulder just ahead. He started running towards it, grateful to finally be getting out of the cold. As he got closer, the driver's side door opened, and the driver got out. But something was immediately and unnervingly wrong. The way the person moved was off. They were stiff. Their body movements were awkward and jerky, almost robotic. He was just about to say something when a brilliant bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the entire scene for a split second. And what he saw in that flash of light turned his blood to ice. The driver wasn't a person. It looked exactly like one of those mannequins you see in a department store window. It had a completely blank facial expression, with just a faint, painted-on smile. The way it was walking towards him was unnatural, a horrifying, stiff-legged gait that was utterly inhuman. Before he could even process this terrifying sight, the passenger door opened. Another figure stepped out in the same awful, stilted manner. He could tell from its silhouette against the car's headlights that it was female. Then, another flash of lightning. She, too, was a living dummy. The narrator thinks he screamed. He didn't wait to find out what these things were or what they wanted. He turned and bolted, running off the road and into the 6-foot-tall cornfield that bordered the highway. The ground was wet and muddy from a recent irrigation, and he was slogging through mud up to his ankles, but he didn't stop. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached. He finally paused for a moment to catch his breath, and in that terrifying silence, he heard it. The rustling of corn stalks somewhere behind him. They were in the field. They were following him. He felt lightheaded, dizzy with fear and exhaustion, on the verge of passing out. But then he heard the sound of 2 car doors slamming shut, followed by the engine starting and the car driving away. He didn't dare go back to the highway. He was too scared. He just kept pushing through the muddy cornfield until he came out on the other side, where he finally collapsed, shaking uncontrollably. Stayed there for at least an hour before he finally mustered the courage to start the long walk back to the party in San Joaquin. To this day, he's not sure what he saw. He says it could have been a very elaborate and cruel prank. Just some people in masks, trying to scare travelers on a lonely road. But he also says that in that moment, in those flashes of lightning, they looked terrifyingly real. It was a nightmare he had stumbled into on a dark and stormy night. An encounter with something so bizarre and unsettling that he is still not quite sure it ever really ended. Alright, our third story is a classic sleepover tale. The kind that starts with spooky stories told under the covers and ends with a terrifying real-life encounter. This one taps into the power of urban legends and the chilling question, what if the monster you summon actually shows up? The year was 2005. Our narrator was a 12-year-old girl having a sleepover with a couple of friends. As is tradition, they stayed up all night, telling each other scary stories. One of the girls brought up a local legend, a creature known only as the Pig Lady. The story was simple and terrifying. The Pig Lady was a spirit with the body of a woman, but the face of a pig. According to the legend, if you said her name 3 times, she would appear and chase you. The girl telling the story swore that it had actually happened to her and some old friends, that they had summoned the Pig Lady and been chased through the woods. The narrator didn't believe a word of it, but she played along. To prove her point, the friend decided to do it right then and there. She chanted it out. Pig Lady, Pig Lady, Pig Lady. Nothing happened. They all laughed it off, and the narrator felt vindicated. It was just a silly scare myth, nothing more. Eventually, they all went to sleep. It was a dark and stormy night, and the narrator, being the guest, was given the spot on the bed right under the big, curtainless window. As her friends drifted off to sleep, she lay awake, listening to the rain and the rumble of thunder. Suddenly, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the entire room, and in that split second, she could have sworn she saw someone standing outside the window, looking in. But when she blinked, they were gone. She told herself it was just her imagination, spooked by the scary stories, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, the girls decided to walk to a nearby store. As they walked along the deserted, tree-lined road, they started talking about the Pig Lady again. Emboldened by the daylight, one of the friends decided to tempt fate once more. She chanted the name 3 times, and then, all of them, caught up in the moment, yelled it at the top of their lungs. Pig Lady, Pig Lady, Pig Lady. And that's when they heard it. The sound of footsteps behind them. They were the only ones on this road. The nearest house was over a mile away. A cold dread washed over them. They were all too afraid to look back. They kept walking, and every time they stopped, the footsteps stopped too. Finally, in a state of near denial, the narrator knew she had to look. She turned her head for just a second, and what she saw was, in her words, the worst thing she had ever seen in her life. It was a woman, dressed in a blue jumpsuit and a baseball cap. As soon as the narrator looked, the woman lifted her head, and her face was the face of a pig. The narrator took off running, screaming at the top of her lungs, not daring to look back again. She could hear her friend's screams right behind her. They ran for what felt like an eternity, not stopping until they reached the store about 10 minutes later. When she finally risked a glance behind her, there was nothing there. The road was empty. The woman, the thing, had simply vanished. They were all out of breath, terrified, and completely unable to process what had just happened. They called the friend's mom and made up a story about a strange guy watching them, just so she would come and pick them up. For years, they swore to each other that it never really happened, that it was just their overactive imaginations getting the best of them. But the narrator is left with a chilling question she couldn't answer. How could they all have imagined the exact same impossible thing? And how could that person, that creature, just vanish into thin air? It was a terrifying experience that proved that sometimes the stories you tell in the dark have a way of following you into the light. 26.5s. Alright, for our fourth story, we're heading to the remote roads of the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota. This is a classic phantom hitchhiker story, but with a deeply unsettling and mysterious twist. It's a tale that has been passed down by word of mouth, a warning to anyone traveling that lonely stretch of road after dark. The story comes from the early 1970s and revolves around the narrator's older cousin. He and his family were having a drinking party at their home in an area known as Bull Creek. As the night wore on, the beer started to run low. So he and his son were elected to make the 10-mile run to the bordering town of Kilgore, Nebraska, to restock. It was a dark, desolate road. About 2 miles into the trip, he saw a man and a woman walking on the side of the road ahead of them. Without a second thought, he slowed down, stopped the car, and called out to them in the Lakota language, "Get in, we'll give you a ride." But the moment he stopped, they were gone. They had simply vanished. He said goosebumps ran up and down his entire body. Shaken and confused, he threw the car back into drive and sped off. Tried to rationalize it, to tell himself his eyes were playing tricks on him in the dark. But about 2 miles further down the road, he saw them again. The same man and woman walking on the side of the road. He stopped again, determined to figure out what was going on. And just like before, the instant the car came to a stop, the two walkers disappeared into thin air. This time, there was no rationalizing it. He was terrified. He floored it all the way to Kilgore, bought the beer, and in a gesture of respect or fear, he opened a can and poured its contents out onto the ground before starting the long, nerve-wracking drive home. Thankfully, he didn't see the walkers again on the way back. When he got back to the party and told everyone what had happened, the lively atmosphere came to a dead stop. Everyone looked at each other, their faces filled with fear. Someone immediately lit a sage bundle to cleanse the space, and the party broke up soon after, everyone too spooked to continue. Since that time, the story of the vanishing walkers has become a local legend. Other people have claimed to see them, to stop and offer them a ride, only to watch them disappear. The story serves as a chilling, informal warning passed down through the community. No one is to walk that road after dark, drunk or sober. The narrator heard this story directly from his cousin's wife years later. A terrifying account of a night when a simple beer run turned into an encounter with two spirits, who are forever walking. A lonely, dark road forever, just out of reach. All right, for our fifth story, we're shifting gears a little bit. Not every haunting is about a malevolent spirit or a terrifying demon. Sometimes a house is just filled with echoes of the past, with spirits who are lost, sad, and just want to be heard. This is one of those stories, a touching and mysterious account from the Fraser Valley of British Columbia. In July of 1991, our narrator and her husband bought a small, peaceful home in the country, surrounded by dairy farms and rolling hills. It was their quiet little piece of paradise, but they soon discovered they weren't entirely alone. It started a few weeks after they moved in. In the middle of the night, they were both jolted awake by the distinct sound of two women in a heated, angry argument. They got up, searched the house, and looked outside, but everything was still and silent. Their neighbor's dog, which barked at everything, hadn't made a sound. The motion detector lights hadn't been triggered. There was no logical explanation. A few minutes later it happened again, just as loud and just as inexplicable. The next day, their neighbor said she hadn't heard a thing. Then a new, gentler phenomenon began. The narrator would wake up in the morning to the distinct, comforting aroma of fresh coffee and baking bread filling the house. But when she would go into the kitchen, there was nothing there. It was a phantom breakfast, a ghostly routine that happened almost every morning they lived there. But the most heartbreaking part of the haunting started after their own grandchildren came to visit. The kids would play in the yard, filling the quiet property with laughter and joy. But almost every time, shortly after they left, and the house fell silent again. The narrator and her husband would hear it, the unmistakable sound of a small child crying. They would search, but of course, there was never anyone there. It was a sound of pure loneliness, a heartbreaking pattern that made it seem as if a little ghost in the house missed the other children. One day the contact became even more direct. The narrator was alone when she heard the clear, whispered voice of a little girl saying one word, "Grandma." Instead of being terrified, she felt a wave of sadness and empathy. She had read that you should try to speak to spirits to help them, so she did something remarkable. She spoke out loud to the empty house, directly to the crying child. She told the little spirit to keep asking for her grandma, to keep calling for her to come and help. And after that day, the sound of the crying child was never heard again. The other strange things, the phantom arguments, the smell of coffee, continued for the rest of the time they lived in the house. Years later, while having a new roof put on, the roofers made a discovery. They found old burn marks in the attic, concentrated right over the kitchen area. There had been a fire in the house at some point, a tragedy that could easily explain the presence of lost and lingering spirits. The couple eventually sold the house. The new owners tore the old building down and built a new one on the property. The narrator never found out the full history of the home, but she likes to think she helped that lost little girl finally find her peace, all thanks to a simple act of kindness. All right, let's move on to our sixth story. This one is a classic haunting. A story about a spirit who is so tied to a home that she continues to make her presence known to the new family living there. It's a tale of moving objects, disembodied voices, and a ghostly touch in the night. The story begins in January of 1991. Our narrator has just moved into a new home. On the very first night, she is woken from a deep sleep by a low, wavering voice calling out a name, John. She sat up in bed, looking around her new, unfamiliar room. Thinking someone was outside, she went to the window, but the cold winter night was still and empty. She went back to bed, only to hear the same sad, calling voice again. John, ... A little spooked, but mostly just wanting to get some sleep. She sat up and said firmly to the empty room, "Get out. This is my house now." And after that, the voice stopped. Several months later, after getting to know her neighbor, she asked about the previous owners and told her about the voice. The neighbor's story sent a chill down her spine. A family had lived in that house for 20 years, and they had a son. His name was John. The neighbor explained that the mother had passed away, and the house was sold. The haunting didn't end with the voice. The narrator's 8-year-old granddaughter, Jenny, also lived with her. She soon began to have her own unsettling experiences. Jenny would often come into her grandmother's room at night, terrified, saying she had woken up and just knew that the ghost was standing right beside her bed. On top of that, small objects around the house would frequently disappear, only to reappear in a different spot days later. This went on for about a year. Then one morning, the narrator was downstairs getting ready for work, when she heard a noise from upstairs. Jenny was in her bed, having been woken up by the ghost during the night. The narrator ran upstairs to find her granddaughter absolutely terrified. Jenny said she had seen the ghost this time. She described a small woman with dark hair standing right next to her. And then she said something that made the narrator's blood run cold. She said the ghost had touched her on the leg, and her whole body was still tingling from the cold, phantom touch. Years went by, and things were relatively quiet. Then the narrator's son and 2-year-old grandson came to live with them. The activity started all over again. The son started complaining about missing objects, just like before. And then he, too, began to wake up in the middle of the night with the distinct, unshakable feeling that someone was in the room with him, standing and watching him sleep. The ghost was back. The narrator says that even now she often feels the spirit's presence when she's sitting alone in the living room at night. But she's no longer afraid. She says that after all these years, she thinks they have finally learned to live with each other. Quiet. Constant presence, a mother's spirit forever calling out for the son who is no longer there. Alright, for our 7th story, we're exploring a type of haunting that is deeply personal and incredibly mysterious. This isn't about a spirit tied to a single house. This is about a strange, sorrowful sound that seems to follow one family across generations and through different homes. It's the story of the crying ghost. Our narrator's first experience with it happened back in 1981. She was a 16-year-old teenager living in Burnaby, British Columbia. She was sitting alone on her back deck, completely absorbed in a book, when she slowly became aware of a strange noise. She describes it as a sound she couldn't quite identify. It was like an animal crying, but it also sounded human, like the whimpering of a small child. The sound grew louder and closer, but when she looked over the deck and into the yard, there was nothing there. It sounded as if whatever was making the noise was only a few feet away, yet it was completely invisible. Spooked, she got her dog and went down into the yard to investigate. The moment she reached the front yard, the noise stopped. She looked everywhere but found nothing. Her dog, however, certainly seemed to see something. It stood staring at a flower bed next to the house, barking and growling, its hackles raised in aggression. The narrator pushed the plants around, thinking a small animal must be hiding there, but there was nothing. The strange event was unsettling, but since it had stopped, she tried to put it out of her mind. Later that night, The entity made its presence known again. She was watching TV with her mom and sister when they all heard a bizarre noise at the living room window. She describes it as the sound of someone taking a wet hand and slowly dragging it all the way down the glass pane, making a long, creepy, squeaking sound. It terrified all of them, but when her dad finally looked outside, there was nothing and no one there. Fast forward 16 years to 1997. The narrator is now an adult, living in a different house in Surrey, British Columbia, with her husband and her 10-month-old son. One day while her son was playing safely behind a baby gate in the living room, she went into the kitchen, and that's when she heard it again. The same weird, whimpering, crying sound from her teenage years. Her first thought was for her son, but when she rushed to check on him, he was playing quietly, not making any sound at all. The noise wasn't coming from him. She stood at the top of the stairs, frozen as the sound seemed to travel up from the ground floor. She could hear the disembodied crying as it passed right by her. Went through the kitchen and stopped abruptly at the back door. The experience was just as inexplicable as it had been years ago. And for the next few days, her cat was completely freaked out, refusing to go near the kitchen door where the sound had stopped. But the story doesn't end there. The narrator reveals that this strange phenomenon seems to be a family affair. She recalls a story her grandparents told her from back in the 1930s. They were sitting at their kitchen table one evening when they heard a similar crying sound start moving around the table right between them. They followed the invisible sound outside to a barn, where it eventually stopped. She's left with no explanation, just a series of bizarre related events that span decades and locations. It seems to her that her family is haunted, followed by a sad, unseen, and unknown entity. A crying ghost whose origins and intentions remain a complete and utter mystery. All right, for our 8th story, we're heading to a small town in northern Michigan. This one is less about a terrifying, aggressive entity and more about a deeply strange and sorrowful mystery. It's about a haunting that was so persistent it became a part of one girl's daily life, the night her best friend finally became a believer. Our narrator was about 14, and she spent a lot of weekends at the house of her best friend, Missy, who was 17. Missy lived in a house where her bedroom was the only room on the second floor, located at the end of a long hallway. For a long time, Missy had been telling a strange story to anyone who would listen to her parents, other friends, and especially the narrator. She would say, "I heard the babies crying again last night." She described it as the unmistakable sound of infants crying coming from the empty hallway just outside her bedroom door. Always happened at night. The narrator had heard her tell this story many, many times, and while she did unthink Missy was lying, it just was in her character to make things up for attention. She could unquite bring herself to believe it either. She would just listen, think, that's weird, and dismiss it, moving on with their day. That all changed one night during a sleepover. The narrator was settled into her usual spot, a cozy blanket nest she had made on the floor at the end of Missy's bed. It just turned out the lights and said goodnight to each other. The room was dark and quiet, and about a minute later, the narrator heard it. The distinct, unmistakable sound of a baby crying. It was coming from the hallway. Her heart started to pound. She whispered into the darkness, "Missy, ... I hear them." Missy's reply was calm, quiet, and absolutely chilling in its resignation. "Don't worry," she said. It will stop soon. And with that single sentence, the narrator knew that everything her friend had been saying was true. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't crazy. The house was haunted. Lay there in her nest of blankets, listening. The sound wasn't static. It would shift, going from what sounded like one baby crying to maybe three, their phantom wails echoing in the hall. Then it would go back down to one, then back to multiple babies crying again. It went on like this for what felt like an eternity, but was probably about 4 or 5 minutes. She remembers the initial fear giving way to a strange sense of annoyance, just wanting the noise to stop so she could sleep. And then it did. The hallway fell silent again. The narrator thinks she said something like, "I don't hear them anymore," and then, somehow, they both just went back to sleep. Ever since that night, she has been a firm believer in ghosts. It wasn't just that she had heard something strange. It was that they had both heard it at the exact same time. It was the calm, validating response from her friend that proved this wasn't a one-time event, but a regular, inexplicable occurrence in that house. They never did learn the backstory. They never found out where the ghostly babies came from, or what their history was. It remains a deeply strange and sorrowful mystery. A story of a house filled with the phantom cries of infants who could never be comforted. All right, for our 9th story, we're going into a home where the paranormal activity isn't just a one-time event, but a constant, evolving presence. This is a story that spans a young man's childhood, from mysterious voices and moving objects to the unsettling feeling of a silent, shadowy observer. Our narrator was 14 when he was telling this story, and it begins when he was just 6 years old, living in a house where strange things were the norm. His room was situated right above a workshop that the previous owner had built in the basement. And through the vent system, he could clearly hear voices coming from the empty basement, a man and a woman talking. The man always seemed angry, swearing and yelling, while the woman would cry, accompanied by the sound of things being thrown. This was a constant, unsettling soundtrack to his childhood. But the activity wasn't just auditory. Lately, he had started seeing a woman in a long white dress pass through his living room in the mornings. One morning, while he was in the shower and home alone, he heard someone walking around, followed by a woman's laughter. The most terrifying experiences, however, happened in his own room. One morning, waking from a nightmare about demons, he felt a cold chill run up his spine, making him shake uncontrollably. He was frozen, unable to move or scream, too afraid to even open his eyes. And then he heard a whisper, right in his ear, saying, "Thank you for the things you're going to remember in your head." And then there was the shadow. A few weeks ago, as he was lying in bed, he looked at his wall and saw the distinct shadow of a person sitting down. It looked like they were wearing a cloak or a hood. Assuming it was just a trick of the light, got up and moved things around his room lamps, furniture, trying to figure out what was casting the shadow. But no matter what he did, the shadow didn't move. Later that night, it was still there. As an experiment, he put his foot down right where the shadow person would be sitting. The moment he did, he felt an insane, bone-chilling sensation of cold. The shadow figure has been there, in that same spot on his wall, every single night since. This story isn't just about one haunting, but a house seemingly filled with them. It started with the disembodied arguments of a tragic past echoing through the vents. It grew to include a ghostly woman in white and a terrifying unseen presence in his own room. And now, it has culminated in the constant, silent vigil of a cloaked shadow figure, a permanent and chilling fixture in the corner of his room. A dark observer whose purpose and identity remain a complete and terrifying mystery. All right, for our 10th and final story in this block, we're heading out onto the dark, lonely highways of Texas. This is a story for anyone who's ever been driving late at night, staring into the pitch-black void and seen something they just can't explain. This is a full-blown, terrifying, and physically impossible encounter with the unknown. The year was 2011. Our narrator, a construction worker, was driving home after a long day in the town of Alice, Texas. It was getting late, almost 8 p.m. He was on the main highway, a desolate stretch of road that gets incredibly dark at night. As he was driving, his mind on potential jobs, he noticed something up ahead, a series of moving white lights on the side of the road. As he got closer, the lights began to change colors, shifting from white to green to blue and then to red. They were dancing, moving up and down, and then, in a circular motion, his curiosity getting the better of him, he slowed down and then stopped his truck on the shoulder to get a better look. He started running through the possibilities. Another vehicle? Some kind of prank? His mind quickly went to the stories he'd read about UFOs and strange lights in the sky. He was starting to think he might be having his own close encounter. To get a better sense of what was happening, he turned off his engine, leaving his headlights on, and rolled down his window, listening for any sound. But there was nothing. The dancing lights were completely silent. And then the nature of the encounter shifted from strange to threatening. The lights, which had been moving erratically, suddenly grouped together and became motionless. It was as if they had become aware of him watching them. Then they started to get brighter, and they started moving towards him. A jolt of panic shot through him. He decided he had seen enough. He turned the key to start his truck, but as soon as he did, the engine died. He tried again. It was sluggish, refusing to turn over properly. Meanwhile, the lights, now a brilliant golden color, were getting closer and brighter. He finally managed to get the engine started. He flipped on his headlights, and what happened next is something that defies all logic and physics. The beams from his own headlights started to bend. He watched in stunned disbelief as the cones of light from his truck, which should have been shining straight ahead, curved in the air, drawn towards the approaching golden lights. He says, "I kid you not. I've never seen the likes of that before. Is that even possible?" He didn't wait to find out. He slammed the truck into drive and floored it, getting the hell out of there. As he sped away, he looked in his rearview mirror. The golden lights were following him. Were now in a perfect single-file formation. His speed was up to 80 miles per hour, but they were gaining on him. Then, one by one, they caught up and passed directly over his truck, bathing the interior of his cab in an eerie golden hue. Heading east and away from the road, he saw it happen one last time. His headlight beams, still shining down the highway, bent again. Following the strange lights as they disappeared over the horizon, he was left alone on that dark highway, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. He was completely shaken up by the experience, a terrifying and impossible event that he still can't explain. He had witnessed something that broke the laws of nature, a silent, intelligent, and powerful force that toyed with him on a lonely Texas road before vanishing back into the night.